Let's talk about racking up. The first thing you need to think about is what to bring. You'll see this phrase thrown around in climbing guidebooks, standard rack. What is that exactly? If you ever see in the route description under what gear you need to protect the route, that phrase, standard rack, the first thing you should do is flip back to the introductory section of that guidebook and see if they define that term. They probably do. Most guidebooks will say, this is what we mean when we say standard rack. Because that really does vary from place to place. The obvious example is back east, some of the crags there like the Gunks and Seneca Rocks, everybody carries tri-cams because they're so useful in the little pockets and horizontal placements. Out west here, a standard rack would just generally be cams and nuts. Whatever they mean by standard rack, figure that out from turning to the early sections of that guidebook or ask around. This is what I would mean if I said standard rack. This is generally what I carry. I have a nice selection of nuts. I believe there are 11 of them on this carabiner at the moment, which is a lot of nuts on one carabiner. It's getting a bit unwieldy. When I go to places like Yosemite with super bomber fine-grained granite, where I tend to find more trustworthy placements for the tiny gear, I bring a few more small nuts and then I split them between two carabiners so they're easier to deal with. Moving on to cams, again, if I were going to Yosemite, I would add 2 more smaller cams, but here in Joshua Tree, where the rock is really coarse grained, I don't find as many placements for the tiny pieces, so this is the smallest piece I carry here in Joshua Tree, and then 1 each of the next 2 sizes up. And then I'm doubled from that nice yellow Perfect Fingers size. Notice 2 different manufacturers, and I find that these cams fit in slightly different places, which is nice. I'm just carrying 1 of the next size above that, but I often carry 2. And again, I'll carry 2 from 2 different makers. A lot of different manufacturers make cams that size gray for whatever reason, and yellow seems to be pretty universal. I got a couple in more of a wide finger size. The color schemes have stopped matching up quite so well between the manufacturers here, but I'm doubled in that size. And these, although ostensibly the same size, are wildly different pieces. This is a much narrower head width, and this one actually compresses quite a bit smaller and will fit in narrower placements. So they're really not exactly the same size, which I like. From there, I'm just doubled in the 3 cam sizes that I find most useful in place all the time, the 0.75, 1, and 2. And I carry typically a single 3 and a single 4, although to cut weight, I'll sometimes leave the 4. But it is a great piece to have. If I don't use it on the route, I'll often use it in building the anchor. For extending gear here in Joshua Tree, I carry a mix of quick draws and slings. Quick draws are just a little quicker and easier when you want to clip to a bolt or a piece, but you don't need to extend it much. And then of course, when you do need to extend a piece, you need those shoulder slings. And it's nice to have 1 double length. Sometimes I'll carry more, especially in the alpine. But here I carry 1 double length for when you're doing a route that goes way around a corner and you really need to extend a piece to reduce drag. It's also a convenient extra bit of anchor building material that you have with you. Always on my harness, I have a few basic tools. I like to have 1 large HMS style carabiner that works well with a munter. I'll have my 3rd hand on the tiniest, lightest little locking carabiner I can find. I have my standard belay rappel device, a cordelet and a couple lockers for anchor building. And then I also carry a gree-gree, because I find for belaying direct off the anchor in a multi-pitch or lead follow setting, the rope just runs so smoothly through the gree-gree. And pulling a rope through a plaquette all day will really start to affect your elbows, which is an issue in my line of work. I like to always have a nut tool on my harness. You and your partner can get away with just having 1 nut tool between the 2 of you, and just remember to pass it to whoever's cleaning the pitch. Eventually you'll forget to make that pass, and then you'll be struggling to remove a nut without the cleaning tool. I like to just always have one and encourage my partner to have one of his or her own. I would add a few more thin pieces if I were going to Yosemite, and I might remove the 4 in particular, and maybe thin out the rack in other ways too if I were going on a long mission into the alpine and wanted to make my pack super light. Let me show you how I like to organize my gear. There's no right or wrong here. Most of it is just personal preference. I will say though, you should do it the same way every time, pretty much, so that when you're under pressure on lead and you need to grab a piece quick and place it, you know where it is. That said, I will rack a couple different ways for a couple different purposes. I usually like to use a gear sling. I do a lot of crack climbing. where I might really be depending on a right-hand jam and I need to place gear with my left, or vice versa. With the gear sling, I can really easily get at stuff with either hand. Also, when I find myself wedging a hip in a corner, I can swing the gear sling out of the way. I could throw it over the other arm and swing it over the other hip. So I can really just put the gear where I want it with the gear sling and access it with either hand. It does become a pain when you're in overhanging terrain. It really flops around and gets in your way. So I'll rack directly on my harness for really steep routes. And a lot of people just don't like the gear sling. It makes it harder to see your feet and it flops around. So a lot of people just always rack on their harness, which is fine. All a matter of preference, what you're comfortable with and what feels familiar. How do I organize my gear sling? This is actually the opposite of how I think most people do it. I like to keep the little stuff in the back and the big stuff in the front. A lot of people think, oh, it's harder to see what you're grabbing when you go for the little stuff, so let's keep it up front, which totally makes sense. To me, I feel like if I have the biggest cams in the back, they hang down and get tangled on stuff. So I keep the big guys up front where I can kind of keep them out of trouble. So I rack from small to big. I also like to rack gate in. To me, that just feels like the way my hand and arm want to work, but it's just a matter of preference. If your partner racks gate out, you should put their gear back that way. That's how they want it. There's no right or wrong way there. So I've got most of my gear and a couple of quick draws for easy access on the gear sling. And then on my harness, I have the rest of my slings and draws. I just keep them right there on my right hip, and I can get to that with either hand, I find. And I actually tend to put, if I'm carrying a number 4, I tend to put the big guy there on my right hip where I can kind of keep it out of the way. On the back of my right side, I have all my anchoring and belay tools and my cleaning tool. And I don't keep anything on my left side because I like to wear my gear sling over my left shoulder. And if I have anything clipped to these loops, the gear sling, the stuff on the gear sling gets tangled with that stuff. So my left side is clean. Here's how I would rack my gear directly on my harness. I'd put about half the cams, more or less one of each size, on my left side along with a bunch of slings and draws. And then on my right side, the rest of the cams, again about one of each size, so with either hand I can grab whatever I need. I keep the nuts on my right side because I am right-handed, and that's the one thing that I find is easier for me to do with my dominant hand. Although I can place a nut with my left, I prefer to use my right. And then on the back side of my right hip are all the tools that I always keep there. I just keep them there anyway so I can find them. And you might notice I clip gate side out when I clip to my harness, although I prefer to clip gate side in on a gear sling. That's just what feels comfortable to me. There's really not a right or wrong way when you're talking about gate out versus gate in.